In week 3 of our series, we started an exercise getting up each morning and praying, Father, please speak to me today, and a commitment to do whatever it is that he invited us to do. I suggested that God would respond to that prayer with invitations that would be simple, immediately doable, and would center on immediate and close relationships to start off with: family, roommate, work colleague, spouse, children, neighbors, key close relationships in the moment. After a few weeks of that, I encourage you to start praying that prayer at random moments throughout the day, still committed to immediate obedience. A few weeks later, I explained the purpose of the exercise, which you have perhaps discovered. The whole point of the prayer is that it brings an awareness of God's presence into that moment. It's a prayer without personal material agenda. The only agenda is conversation. Father, please speak to me. If you've kept up with the exercises, you should be discovering that God is always present, even when we are not aware or are distracted by other things. That the moment you pray that prayer, Father, speak to me, he is never not there. He is always there. Most of us see God's presence as a resource, a tool for us to use. For most of us, when we think of hearing God, we think of help with decision making. We think of trying to figure out which college to attend, this job or that job, major purchases, major expenses, important life decisions and direction. Should I do this or that? Door number 1 or door number 2? And we find it hard to hear God because we only ever listen when we need something. We pray because we want God to answer us with respect to a specific request or decision we need to make or direction. And we want him to do so on demand. I wonder if it's because our prayers are usually focused on personal needs, desires, direction, decisions, that we so often miss or misunderstand God's answers, like the story today. None of the gospel writers provide a name for the main character, but Matthew tells us the individual was a young man. Luke tells us he was a ruler, that is, a leader in the community. And all three tell us he was extremely wealthy. Most of us who grew up in the church will know this as the story of the rich young ruler. If you're not familiar with the story, I'd encourage you to pause the video, find a Bible, and read it through. It's recorded 3 times in the scriptures. Matthew records it in his gospel, chapter 19, starting at verse 16. Mark records it in his gospel, starting at chapter 10. Mark chapter 10, starting at verse 17. And Luke has it in his gospel in chapter 18, starting at verse 18. Why don't you go ahead, pause the video, and I'll wait. I'll be here when you come back. So the story starts, as most of our prayers do, with a personal need, with a lack, a shortfall. Something is missing, and we come to God in prayer to fix the issue. This young, rich community leader comes up to Jesus with a question because he has become aware that something is missing in his life. Nothing that he has in his life is sufficient to fill the void. We know he's rich, but his money is not enough. We know he's young, but his youth is not enough. We know he's a leader, but position and power have not been enough. We know he's religious, but religion is not enough. Something is missing. We know all this because he tells us this as he has his questions for Jesus. So he, like we do, comes to Jesus looking for an answer, seeking help. Jesus, what must I do? Jesus tells him, what you need to do is obey God's command. You need to do what God has told you to do. Now, don't get fooled by Jesus' responses. Jesus is intentionally setting something up. He doesn't want this desperate young man to miss the point, so Jesus, is letting him set the pace with his questions and is guiding him along step by step. The young man is eager. Which instructions, which commands should I obey? And theologians will note that Jesus doesn't list all 10 of the commandments and will argue about why Jesus doesn't recite them in the same order as they appear in Exodus 20, and Jesus seems to focus on those that deal with our relationships with each other. Now, while these are interesting discussions, they are not our focus today. Now, I may be wrong, but I think the young man interrupts Jesus before he can finish the list. And he says, I know, I've been doing this stuff all my life. He's a good religious person. In our lingo, he's a good little Christian boy, obeying all the rules. But at some point in his journey, he has realized that being a good person is not enough, that being in synagogue on Sabbath is not enough, that keeping the commandments and following the rules is not enough. This is a kind of continuation from our message last week, which you can check out online here as well. But even obeying the commandments, not enough. Hearing without obedience is nothing. Obedience still falls short of what God desires for us. So this young man says to Jesus, I've been keeping those rules since I was a kid. I know there's more than just keeping the rules. I got lots of money, but I know there's more. I'm young and healthy, but I know there's more. I've got the respect of the community, but I know there's more. I know there's more. What am I lacking? There's still something missing from my life. And Jesus gives his now famous response. Sell all your stuff. Give it to those who need it, those who lack money and position and power and opportunity. Come hang out with me. Become one of my disciples. So I grew up in the church. I've heard I don't know how many messages on this passage, and each one has wrestled with how to apply Jesus' words, go sell all you own. You can't imagine how relieved I was when I was told that Jesus only expects us to be willing to lay it all down and follow him, when pastors and teachers explained that Jesus' words were only meant as a test or only meant for the rich young ruler and for nobody else. The problem with that, of course, is that there are 12 other men standing with Jesus, 12 men who literally, actually gave up everything to follow Jesus. Matthew, as a former tax collector, was probably the wealthiest of the 12 before Jesus passed by one day and said, "Follow me." And he got up and left everything behind, according to Luke chapter 5, verse 28. Peter, James, John, Andrew, all fishermen walk away from the biggest catch of their lives when Jesus called them. Peter even says later on in the same Matthew passage, Matthew 19, we gave up everything to follow you, Jesus. It seems like Jesus isn't speaking only to the rich young ruler. It seems like Jesus actually means what he said. There's no hidden message here. You know what our problem is? Our problem is that we're missing the point. We're so worried about what Jesus has to say about material possessions, we miss what he's actually offering. Again, let me be clear so there's no doubt. Jesus calls us to wholehearted, sacrificial devotion. Make no mistake about it. But stop thinking about your stuff for a moment. Stop looking at the cost and consider the invitation. The real point here was not that the young man was being called to leave behind all his stuff. The real point here is not what he was being called to leave. The point is what he was being invited to participate in. Relationship. Jesus didn't tell him to take a year-long pilgrimage. Jesus didn't tell him to fast until he broke through. Jesus didn't tell him to start a ministry. Jesus didn't ask for a donation. Jesus didn't tell him to go serve among the poor or the lepers. Jesus says, if you really want to know what's missing in your life, come hang out with me. Here it is again. The rich young ruler knew something was missing. He comes to Jesus asking, what must I do? I know something is missing. Jesus says, do what God has told you to do. He says, I've been doing that for years, but there's still something missing. Jesus says, if you really want to be whole, complete, perfect, come walk with me. Come hang out with me. Now, of course, that means you'll have to leave everything behind. And so don't just leave it lying around. Put it to good use by being generous with those in need. Then come, follow me. It seems to me that Jesus isn't so much telling him to give everything away as Jesus is inviting him into relationship, inviting him to come hang out. You see it? Jesus is inviting this rich young ruler to come and enter into relationship with him. The fact that we focus so much on the giving up of material possessions, the way we work at trying to soften the clear command and totally miss the relationship piece, only exposes how focused we are on stuff over relationship. And therein lies the point. We still value material possessions, material stuff, more than we desire intimacy with Jesus.